From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everybody. We can be a little louder than that. I think it's almost noon, right? Hello, everybody. My name is Audie Cornish, and I host NPR's All Things Considered. And I am a sometime panelist on NPR's pop culture podcast, Pop Culture Happy Hour, and like you, a book lover. NPR is a media partner this year with the National Book Festival. We want to thank the co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and the many National Book Festival partners like the ARP. Thank you so much. Now, today we're going to have a conversation with two amazing writers. It's not my idea to put them in the same room, so whoever's idea it was, let's say thank you to them. Winston Groom, author of the forthcoming novel, El Paso. Winston Groom was D.C. born and Alabama raised, and he's mined history for much of his writing career, from his first novel, set during the Vietnam War, to his nonfiction works like Shrouds of Glory, about one of the final campaigns of the Confederate Army. And of course, you might have heard of a little book called Forrest Gump. Popularized by the motion picture that followed, it's a romp through boomer generation history, told through the eyes of a Southern man with the knack for being in the right place at the right time. Now, Winston Groom comes to us today on the eve of publishing his latest book, El Paso. And that book, and you'll need this for the rest of the conversation, is set during the early 1900s, during the Great War, the Mexican Revolution, when an American railroad tycoon finds his family kidnapped and his Mexican cattle business under siege by a cutthroat revolutionary. That book is out in early October. Winston Groom, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Our second author is Colson Whitehead, who is a New Yorker born and raised. Colson Whitehead has made his mark basically dancing in and out of genres. A zombie apocalypse in the novel Zone 1, corporate culture satire in Apex Hides the Hurt, and a myth-busting turn in the novel John Henry Days. He joins our stage today having just published The Underground Railroad. That's the story that imagines what if the network of former slaves and abolitionists that helped runaways leave the South had an actual underground train. The book is out everywhere, including Oprah's book club. Colson Whitehead, welcome to the stage. So I have a little bit of house cleaning before we start. Number one, this is your opportunity to turn your cell phones off. And think about the questions you might have towards the end. We are going to have a Q&A. So to start, I want to ask with something that I noticed in the start of your book, Winston Groom, which is that you said this is not a historical novel in any conventional sense. So tell us, define that. What to you does it mean to do a historical?
Well, when I think of an historical book, I think of like Prince Valiant or something. This is historical characters that I used to move my story along. It was a historical setting that I wanted because it was a story that a friend of mine told me about his father. My friend was a Morgan, a New York Morgan, it was a different family from JP, lived with the cousins. But they were quite wealthy, and in the late 1800s, they owned an enormous cattle ranch in Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua. And the elder Mr. Morgan, who had been, I believe, the governor of New York, used to take his private railroad car down there to inspect his 250,000 head of cows or whatever it was. Unfortunately, in 1916, the American Revolutionary bandit General Pancho Villa had begun to depredate these American holdings down there. And he, in fact, my friend's story was he took the manager of the farm, of the cattle ranch, and he strung him up and he sabred him to death, had him sabred to death. He'd kidnapped two of his children. And so that story captivated me to the extent that I've thought about it for 20 years. And I wrote on it for 20 years, but I could never get it right until about a year and a half ago. threw everything aside and flew with it. But what I have in the story is that it is the grandchildren of this wealthy railroad baron. He's not a Morgan, I changed his name. But to make it a short story, as you do in Hollywood, if you're going to pitch a movie, they say pitch it in the space that it takes between an elevator ride. So to make a long story short, there's about 400 and something pages, and 300 and something of them concern a manhunt through the high Sierras to try to get back these kidnapped children.
And this manhunt takes place in northern Mexico, and throughout the book, they sprinkle real-life characters. You sprinkle real-life characters, John Reed and Ambrose Pierce, and names from the period. Colson Whitehead, I want to ask you, with your book, The Underground Railroad, it kind of mimics a slave narrative in that it's told from the point of view of one particular slave for much of the book, and you don't necessarily draw names from the period. Am I correct about that? It's a little bit of an alternate universe.
Yes, I mean, it starts off hopefully in a realistic 1850, and then the premise is that the Underground Railroad is an actual railroad, and so you're already departing from reality, as far as I know, and it's not straight historical. And then each state our protagonist goes through, South Carolina, North Carolina, is a different state of American possibility, sort of like Gulliver's Travels. So definitely the later chapters don't stick to the historical record, and for the most part aren't inspired by real folks, although real events do inform what happens to our protagonist, Cora. But I did want the first section that takes place on the plantation where Cora lives and works and has many troubles to be realistic and take place in I guess what most people would call a historical novel, imaginative space.
And I just want to make it clear, this does not feel like science fiction when you're reading it. I read, the first chapter of your book, and I just put it down for 5 days because it was pretty intense. And I think when you go back into these periods, writers, I assume, in your research, look for, totems or actual artifacts from the period that help inform your work. And for you, can you list some of the things that you found that helped you inform sort of how you went about the story?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there are a few general histories of the Underground Railroad. Bound for Canaan by Fergus Bordewich came out about 8 years ago. Well, my main source were the actual slave narratives, pre-Civil War, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, sort of famous ones. And then in the 1930s, FDR, being a nice guy, trying to get people back to work during the Great Depression, had the Works Progress Administration, and they sent out writers to interview former slaves, people who'd been kids or teenagers at the time of the Civil War. And that was my biggest resource. I drew a lot of slang and words, physical details about how they lived, which really made the work come alive for me. I don't know, like, before I started, what kind of clothes they wore or food they ate. And you come across a reference to an ash cake. It's like, what's an ash cake? That sounds terrible. And then you read up on it. It's like, actually, it's worse than you really thought. So, as I was going through these oral narratives, I would just take out nouns and adjectives, things that sounded great, and then when it was time to write, I would have this storehouse of vocabulary to make it rich.
Winston Groom, for you, similarly, this is a period of American history and a region that people don't talk so much about, these border skirmishes between Mexican revolutionaries and American landholders, essentially. What kinds of materials were available that helped you understand the period?
Oh, there's tons of it. It's not very much read. There was a great big war going on in Europe in this period, 1916. That was the First World War. But the Americans had an army down there of some sort, not a huge army, under General Pershing. And his assistant was Lieutenant George S. Patton, who made a name for himself in World War II. And of course, there's a great deal on General Patton, a great deal on General Pershing. General Patton's diary is terrific on that area. But I threw in some other people just for the hell of it. Ambrose Bierce, who was a crusty old guy who wrote something called the Devil's Dictionary.
Yeah.
And he was down there, and nobody knows what happened to him. There's many versions. I got him. I'll tell you what happened to him. I made it up. That's good.
But one thing is, when I was reading it, then I wasn't sure whether to trust this character that I was reading. I was like, did he make this one up? Is this a real person? How should I feel about this? What's your view on kind of taking poetic license with the
I got you thinking about it, didn't
Yeah, you did.
That's the way it did. Once I get these people down there was the old cowboy actor, Tom Mix, and he was just rumored to have been there as some kind of guy with Ambrose Bierce. There's no factual proof of it, but that's the good thing about doing fiction. And I've done enough nonfiction in the last 20 years. That's all I've written is histories. It's fun to be able to play with the characters as long as you don't get them out of character. And I tried not to do that. I tried for instance, John Reed was down there, and he was a famous journalist who became a communist and was driven exiled from this country, went over to cover the Russian Revolution, and he died there, buried there with all the famous communists. But he was down there covering that revolution. So I sort of put them all in the pot and mixed them up and see how they came out. Sometimes it's like a cement mixer, and sometimes it's like a smoother mixer. It's all mixed up.
I had sort of had the opposite problem with your book, where I thought, oh, I thought this was going to deviate more from the history than it really did. In fact, it felt actually super grounded in the history. And I just had a question. When you're writing, you are world building, right? But when you're writing history, that world is built already. So how do you decide, like, okay, what's going to exist and what's not going to exist in this world?
Well, I had a few rules. I mean, before the book takes off into sort of the alternative histories, I wanted to have that first section be as realistic as possible.
And this is life on the plantation.
Yeah, and so it is very brutal, as you were saying, because that's the way the plantation system was. And the more research I did, the more horrified I got as I was reading it with an adult perspective on the violence. Just to pay tribute to my nameless ancestors who went through the system, lived and died in Louisiana or Florida or Georgia, who knows. Most of my family history doesn't go back isn't traceable before 1900. I wanted to make it as realistic as possible, and then also for just everyone who went through that terrible experience before I start playing with history, playing it straight. And then once things are altered, my rule was I won't stick to the facts, but I'll stick to the truth. And so as the conversation about slavery and race in America gets larger and larger, chapter to chapter, I was moving historical events around in order to get to a larger truth. And so, we're talking about making things up.
Sometimes you got to lie a little bit to tell the truth.
Sure, yeah. And the ability to make things up. Historians, hopefully you're playing it straight. And then sometimes, the fun of the fiction writer is being able to break the rules.
It's interesting to hear you say get to the truth, because I think with both of these periods that you've tackled, the sort of last throes of American West mythology and the many ways the story of slavery has been written and rewritten and interpreted depending on who's writing it, kind of what is the truth, right? Like, as you're deciding, how much do you police yourself for a modern lens, right, when you're looking back?
Well, I think it comes down to me to believability. If you get people to believe it, then you've got a story. For instance, when I wrote Forrest Gump, I didn't know what I was doing, and I got to the point where I had him playing football for Coach Paul Bear Bryant at the University of Alabama, and I thought, if they will believe that a perfect idiot can play football for Bear Bryant, they'll believe anything. So I said, I got you. I'll do what I want to. But that's the same way with this. I just tried to keep the characters in character. There are a lot of characters in my story who are nobody. I mean, they're not well-known or historical figures. And those are the main characters, which is, I think, why I differentiate between what I did and what is normally called historical fiction. Most of the characters, the development of the characters is an ongoing thing between these, mainly Arthur, the son of the old man Shaughnessy, the rich railroad baron. His grandchildren were kidnapped. This is his kids that are kidnapped. And he's not ready for the trail. He's a guy from Boston who's a butterfly collector. And he has to undergo a lot of tough stuff, and we see it all along the way before he finally faces down General Pancho Villa to get his kids back, and he outdraws him. And it's that kind of thing that I think just keeps the reader. When I do this, I know how to do it because I've done it a lot as a novelist before I was a historian or a historical writer anyway. And you just got to keep the story moving and keep the reader on the edge to say something is going to happen here pretty soon. And then after it happens, they go back to being comfortable. As soon as they get comfortable, I make it uncomfortable for them again.
And for you, Colson Whitehead, I mean, I think when you take apart something to put it back together, you learn new things from it. And in trying to understand this period, how did it change the way you thought of the runaway story?
Well, I think, definitely in the first section, I was trying to make a psychologically rich or plausible account of plantation life. For me, as someone writing in 2015, I was writing it last year. I think we have an idea of the 100-person plantation from movies. Obviously you could be a slave in a single brownstone in Baltimore working for a family, or one of two slaves on a small farm. So for me, everyone's had their own different interpretation of history. Before I started, sometimes you want to get infected with other people's take on the subject, sometimes you don't.
Although when you use the word infected, I'm going to assume that you don't.
It sort of depends. But this time I was like, I haven't read Beloved in 25 years. I haven't read The Known World in 14 years. I'll go back. And started Beloved again. I was just like, after 30 pages, I was like, I'm screwed. You can't beat Toni Morrison. Obviously.
Confirmed.
Duh. So all I can do is hope that, I have a unique take that I can add to our idea of what slave literature is, or, plantation depictions, no matter what you write.
But what was that idea, right? I mean, for me, when I read the book, I thought that you took us inside the minds of images we are familiar with. For instance, the image of a hanging before a crowd. And there are all those faces, right? The black bodies hanging, white faces looking into the camera. And in one of these chapters of the book, you kind of take us into a community that would have held such an event. Were you trying to get us to think of some point of views maybe that we don't normally?
Well, I mean, I don't think, the depiction of the lynching in the book, which happens once a week as a sort of entertainment for this town, isn't historically accurate. They weren't weekly gatherings. But the truth is real. They were, planned entertainments sometimes. You would have the whole town, bring out the kids, and watch your scapegoat, blackmail, lynched, burned alive, take pictures, pose for the camera. There are, big collections of lynching postcards. Like, wish you were here, had a nice time with this lynching. And so I'm making it, into a weekly event, but I'm not pushing it that far. Whenever I thought I was being a bit too brutal on the page, I'll go back to the research and realize that, no, actually, I was sticking to, to a version of reality. I'm one person writing a book for a year, slave masters watching their fathers, coming up with, all sorts of sadistic things for decades and decades to keep people in line. And I can't really compete with all the stuff that they thought up because it was their job to come up with these to keep the brutal system in place.
Both of you have done stints as journalists. Colson Whitehead as a TV critic for the Village Voice, is that correct?
Yeah, that's true.
And Winston Groom, you were at the Washington Star newspaper.
I was with the Washington Star.
So how does that affect how you go about your work? What is it about that particular discipline that still sticks with you?
It opens a door. It doesn't open it all the way. And I know that when I decided to leave the newspaper, I did probably the bravest thing in my life. I went to the editor and said, I'm going to resign. I'm going to write a book. And because I knew that if I failed, I would be too embarrassed to come back to the paper. So I cut that
So you wouldn't be
time.
the first journalist who had
But
made such an attempt.
I started trying to write it in Washington, and you know, we couldn't even clean up a quote, and I was beginning to feel guilty. And Washington is a very political town, and I'm starting to write fiction, and I said I can't do it here. So I went to New York with a fellow writers. But I think the newspaper business certainly teaches you clarity of thought. It teaches you clarity of language. It teaches you brevity. But the finesse that you have to do to translate that into a novel it's a juggling act, and you learn it. I learned it, but it took a while before it didn't sound like newspaper copy. Suddenly it starts zing, and that's fun.
I was amused about the TV angle of your gig because this book in particular feels episodic. The way it's structured, each chapter is in a specific state as this runaway slave is traveling along their path. And I wondered if sometimes you sort of have an eye towards narrative in that way.
No, not so much. I mean, you know, when I was a TV critic, it was the early 90s, and then, like, it was really embarrassing to be a TV critic. Now, like, people are recapping, and it's like you're really engaged with the pop culture. Me, it was like the only gig I could get, and no one else wanted to do it. And when I watch TV now, I'm very glad to be a passive spectator, not have sort of grand theories about why things are working.
Yeah, it had a Twilight Zone feel, a little bit.
I have a question. Can I?
Yeah, please do.
How these fugitive slaves? How were they received? And how would the Fugitive Slave Act involved? I mean, would they have a trade when they got out of the slave states?
Sure. No, I mean,
received nicely. Or?
So this is a question about how the slave narratives were published and received.
Yeah, well, they were political tracts. So the ones from the 1850s, they were printed to get people to abhor the slave system. And so printed by white abolitionists in Massachusetts and New York and disseminated as testimony about the brutal system in the South. And, you know, there was, it became ammunition to end slavery. The ones collected in the 1930s, apart from getting people back to work, you know, I imagine part of the impulse was just to preserve. You know, nobody was keeping track of the slave experience, you know, prior to this century. People were dying off, and so you want to capture it before it's lost. And I'm, you know, particularly very glad.
That answers it.
Now, this is the portion of our afternoon where we're going to take questions from the audience. We have two microphones in the center aisles here, and we'll sort of ping-pong back and forth between the two.
We ask ourselves questions. They don't want to.
Yeah, let's see. There you go.
Yes, there we go. Just wondering about the cross-cultural aspects of both of your books in the sense of covering Mexican events from a different perspective, and also just, you know, the nature of the Underground Railroad was a story that's of interest not just to African American communities or just as told during Black History Month, but it's of interest to a wider audience. How do you honor the integrity of the cultures that you're writing about and you know, talk about that, but also broaden what you're writing about to a wider audience?
Right, Winston Groom, in your book, you are seeing many chapters from the point of view of General Pancho Villa and from some of the people who are working with him as revolutionaries, although they seem to question their role over time.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't do points of view by chapters. I do it by scenes, and so I've got a lot of people doing a lot of things and thinking a lot of things at the same time. It's a literary device. I remember once I was stuck on my first book. I had a scene that was too long. There were too many people talking. And I went to see a friend of mine, James Jones, who had written From Here to Eternity, and among other books. And he was working on his final novel. He was to die in a year or so. But anyway, I said, Jim, I can't seem to get this right. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I just had that problem this morning. instead of having one character think what the other character's thinking about, it'd have the other character think what the other character might be thinking about him too. So you have two or three things all going on at one time, but it keeps the reader on their toes. And I mean, I give everybody a point of view, just about. That can be confusing, but yeah, I think it's useful as far as the flow of the story. You want that story to punch forward all the time.
Colson Whitehead, kind of cross-cultural.
Yeah, I guess, the young gentleman asked about the cross-cultural stories. I guess I don't think about my work in that sort of way. In the same way I don't necessarily think of this as a historical novel. It's just a novel. And so I'm not thinking so much about audience or what I'm transmitting to from my culture or into different audiences, a white audience or whatever. I'm trying to figure out something about the world in each book or something about myself, and hopefully doing it in a way that's artistically cohesive, that other people can come along for the ride. And I always feel fortunate when that works out.
Hello there. Thank you for writing your books, and my question for both of you is, of the historical characters in your books, do you have a favorite one?
Yeah, I don't have any.
So the question, just for everyone here, their favorite character, historical character in their book.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any characters based directly on people. Cora, as our protagonist, is partially inspired by Harriet Jacobs, who's a woman who wrote a slave narrative about leaving her house at age 4, in her teenage years, and hid in an attic for 7 years before she could get passage out of North Carolina. And the female slaves, the dilemma she described in her narrative, motivated me to have a female protagonist. When you're a female slave, when you hit 14, puberty, you're supposed to pump out kids. More kids means more slaves, and more slaves means more cotton and more money, and you're prey to your master desires of other people on the plantation, and that seemed compelling material to explore. And so, while Cora is not based on Harriet Jacobs, definitely reading Harriet Jacobs' narrative 30 years ago in college, sort of bubbled in the back of my mind for many years, and was a partial inspiration for the book.
You have a lot to choose from in terms
Sure.
of characters.
What?
In terms of characters, you have a lot to choose from. Is there a historical figure that became your favorite as you were writing?
Well, I kind of like the contrast between Ambrose Bierce, the Devil's Dictionary guy, and John Reed, who's a communist. And as they go along the trail, they're constantly arguing politics, and it's a sideshow in a way, but it still moves the story forward because you're building a character. So the reader, at the end, they will say, well, I kind of know that fellow, I liked him. And what happened to him, you don't want to know.
Yeah, I have to say, towards the end of the book, various people are dispatched in increasingly creative ways. I did not know how many ways there were to die in the West until I read this book.
It's very Shakespearean.
Yes, it is. It is.
A lot of murders, a lot of blood, wash off hands, so forth.
Ma'am?
Perfect night for a murder.
My question is for Winston Groom. Knowing Birmingham, Alabama, and having visited there a long time, I'm wondering to what extent growing up in Alabama and has influenced your writing, and also where you went to college. I loved hearing about everything that happened after it, but I think those two factors often underlie some of the writing that I've read.
When it comes to education in Alabama, isn't there really only one answer?
Roll Tide.
Are you allowed to give any other answer?
Well, I'd say I went to a boys' military school growing up, and then I went to the University of Alabama, and I was lucky enough, I believe my sophomore year, to have an instructor called Hudson Strode, who had taught my mother dramatics and literature back in the 1920s, and he had a small class that he had of writers. It was above the library with big velvet drapes and a bust of Livy in the corner and a long table, and everybody sat around the old Socratic method of criticizing everybody else's work. And that was, it was useful to that extent. But when I was in college, I was the editor of first the literary magazine, and then the real prize was the Humor magazine. And I thought I was very well equipped to go up to New York and become an editor of Esquire at that point or something. And Dr. Strode, I had to go to Vietnam first with the Army. And I got out of that, and I went up to New York, and he got me appointments. And they were all very nice, and every one of them said the same thing, but you don't have any experience. And I thought, well, I was editing my college literary magazine, didn't have experience. No. So finally, one fellow, Don Erickson, who later became the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, I asked him, I said, well, what am I supposed to do to get this experience? He said, well, why don't you go work on a newspaper? And, okay, I'd never even thought about that. I mean, journalism was not really a subject that was taught well at the University of Alabama in those days. Matter of fact, Joe Namath majored in journalism. And the funny thing was, when he got off the plane in Miami, all the sports writers said, well, Joe, what did you major in at Alabama, basket weaving? He said, no, the same thing you majored in. But in any case, I was lucky enough to get on at the start. I spent 10 years there. And finally, I said, if I don't get a break here, I'm going to wind up with a mortgage and a car payment. And I said, I'm going to give this a shot. So that's the short history of my life.
Colson Whitehead, we should ask the same of you. I think we learn a lot from writers in terms of their early years in which they form their identity. So high school, college?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of writing, I became a writer from reading Marvel Comics and Stephen King and Arthur C. Clarke, Twilight Zone, watching Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, and wanted to make things up. And I think later on in college, when I was a freshman at Harvard, started reading Garcia Marquez and Borges and Beckett, and was introduced to a different way of using fantasy, fantastic effects. It's different when you're dealing with vampires and werewolves than, say, the blasted landscape of Waiting for Godot, but you're using fantasy in different ways. And I think definitely with this book and some other books of mine, I've been still drawing from all the fantasy literature I read when I was in 5th grade and 6th grade, and find inspiration and find different ways of deforming reality to get at that larger truth we were talking about earlier.
We can feel you trying your hand at each genre. Like,
sure, yeah.
Oh, it's zombie time,
No, I mean,
it's like,
you keep writing, and I like poker. I wrote a poker book, and if you keep writing, I guess you get enough time to address things you like, things you like and interest you. So.
This question is for Mr. Whitehead about your novel, The Intuitionist. And I'm curious where the idea for that novel came from, and particularly what was it about the image of an elevator that is so central to that novel? Kind of what is the symbolism of that, and where did that come from?
Sure, yeah.
Do you want me to try and give the synopsis?
Oh, no, yeah. I can do it. It's the question is about the book, The Intuitionist. How it evolved. Well, I'd written the book 2 years before, and everyone hated it, and got 25 rejections. So I figured I'd do something different, and maybe do a book with a plot. People like plot in books, and so I was going to take off from a detective novel structure, and came up with the idea of what if an elevator inspector, someone who inspects elevators, has to become a criminal inspector and solve a criminal case. So I went to the library to see what kind of skills an elevator inspector would bring to a criminal case. And the answer was none, because they inspect elevators. And so the crime in the book became an elevator crime, and then I had to build a world. And so I figured if there were, it's an election, taking off from the detective story, it's an election year in the department, so there's sort of Republicans and Democrats, and that became the intuitionists and empiricists, progressives and conservatives. If there's a school where they learn how to do it, there has to be some sort of academic infighting, and so it's really just building a world. Like, what kind of school? What's their school like? Who's the main theorist behind intuitionism? And each time I would solve a problem, I'd have to, I'd have more questions I'd have to answer. But it was really about building a world in a real kind of science fiction kind of way.
Hi, this is for Mr. Whitehead. Although I love Forrest Gump, always will. I'm like Audie. I read the book, the first chapter, and put it down for multiple days because it was so intense. And the way you build Cora out and she's the main character throughout. What was your intention? What do you want the reader to leave with other than pain?
Well, I think there's more than pain going on with Cora. How do you, I think hopefully when you're reading that first section, you're thinking, how did this go on? How does brutality,
right.
How does the country countenance such depravity? And then you think of how do they survive, and how could any human being endure such horrors intact? And then once you set that up, what does it take to take that first step off the plantation to freedom? Would I have been able to do that, to find that power within myself to run north? I mean, you'd like to think that you're have that kind of strength, but most people didn't. The system was so brutal, you couldn't try it. If you did try it, you get caught, lose a foot. So what kind of character can go through what Cora goes through, and has that courage to run north? And I think it starts there. And in that first section, there are a few moments where I say the human part of her outpaces the slave part of her. And that human part of her is what animates her journey northward. And then as we get to these different situations, her movement to a different kind of freedom. So I think that sort of answers your question, but gets at my intent with Cora.
We could ask a similar question of you, because I think one of the things that happens in this particular story is that you see the way General Pancho Villa operates as he moves through the north from town to town in really brutal ways in the pursuit of his revolution. And what did you want people to take away from that? Because in some ways it definitely undermined the hero aspect of him, right?
Well, I don't think, from what I have read about him, and there's a great deal that's been written about him, and probably 40 or 60% is false. I mean, it's totally contradictory. There's been a couple of good books about him, and I listed them somewhere in the acknowledgments. But that whole country was brutal then. I mean, it was a horrible place to live. The Apaches had brutalized the people, and they had learned from the Apaches. Pancho Villa one time, and this was presumably it was a true story, somebody bet him that he couldn't shoot a man's eye out, and he shot the man's eye out, and then he felt sorry about it, so he gave his wife 100 pesos. That's brutality, but they were rough times, and I mean, he'd have you skinned alive and so forth. General Fiaro, he was known for some very bad deeds. They called him the Butcher. And it wasn't just on the Villa side either, it was on the government side. There was no Cora asked for and none given.
Question over here.
Yes, so my question is for Colson Whitehead. I just wanted to say I loved your book. I thought it was brilliantly written. But I was kind of confused and really baffled by the ending. And I really didn't know what had happened. I know you may not want to give away the ending, but I was wondering what actually happened to the slave hunter and what ultimately happened to Cora, because I didn't quite get it.
Sure, thanks for reading. It hasn't come up a lot. I think most people have come to their own reckoning with Cora's story. I will say this about Cora. Even if she gets to, in an alternative story, gets to Massachusetts and wins the lottery and wins $3 billion, she's still an African-American woman in 1850 in America, which is a racist place. So what is her best case scenario when she lives in a racist country? So maybe I'll leave it there. Maybe that could be work, I hope.
Yeah, but it's an interesting question because if you're talking about brutal periods of history, this is where you come up against the rules of these worlds, right? In terms of the history. There's only so far you're going to get, right, with this character. She
Yes.
doesn't necessarily have a happily ever after. She'll have something, but it's not a tied bow the way we would all like, I think.
First of all, thank you both for your work, because it is work and it's very grueling. And my question, it's a statement and a question, I guess. Your notions about the depiction of history and the implications of that are such that neither of your books can be merely a book. They simply are not. And because of that depiction of everyone, I'm wondering about the role, Mr. Whitehead, of resistance in your book. Because the narrative is that, as you said, people rolled over, basically. And that is not quite an accurate interpretation of the truth, if you will. The truth is that there were over 400 rebellions on the Atlantic Ocean. And the Amistad wasn't the only trip. The truth is that there were 1 million acts of resistance every day, because you don't have to run away to resist. And your Cora did not grow up in a vacuum. She was nurtured, and that energy of taking that step was nurtured and was affirmed, so that resistance, she resisted. And that resistance was rooted in community and in values about, I don't think so. So, I don't know.
Well, we can let him answer. Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. It was a statement that I agree with. So,
Did you have a question to add to this as well?
In your next work, are you going to talk about resistance explicitly and how that went on?
Probably not. Will I address that in my next book? Probably not. I mean, when I'm done with a topic, I like to move on to the next one.
Okay.
And the next book takes place in 1960s Harlem. It has a different sort of striving in there. But I think you're totally right about our daily rebellions, whether it's in contemporary life, how do we keep going, and how do we stand up to the forces arrayed against us? Or 200 years ago, how do we figure out systems and help us get it through the day? And hopefully in core story and in a supporting cast, you get different kinds of stepping up and and different ways of overthrowing tyranny. Thank you.
So much.
Unfortunately, that is our last question because we're towards the end. I think it's a good question to end on because it gets at the idea of responsibility. Whenever you're tackling history, you embrace the responsibility of interpreting that time. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I hope that you'll consider donating to the National Book Festival via their app. There's also information in your program. Colson Whitehead, author of The Underground Railroad, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And Winston Groom. His book is called El Paso. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.